Good evening. This is Friday, February 7th. This is a special truncated edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment on WHUR and Sirius XM, channel 141. I'm Harold Fisher. Tonight, tips for federal workers facing an uncertain future. How do you transfer those public servant skills to the private sector or launch a new career in an ever-evolving job market? Well, tonight, my guest is human resources expert Sean Talley, and he's going to share some practical advice and resources to help you rise above this challenge and open new doors of opportunity. Sean, thank you so much for joining the conversation. This is a really important conversation at a rather difficult time for a lot of people.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Harold.
Sure thing. As you already know, there is a hearing set for Monday as unions have sued to stop President Trump's buyout offer for federal government employees. Just yesterday, a judge paused the deadline because the unions challenged the plan's legality. And of course, Trump has warned that by Tuesday, federal employees could see furloughs if they do not accept that buyout offer. So, as we know, as of today, 65,000 workers have taken the buyout. I can't imagine, first and foremost, how stressful this is for those who want to stay in their jobs and are having to deal with the prospect of having to find another job. What do you tell them?
Yeah, so this is something that is unprecedented. And anyone that can tell you that they know the playbook for this is not being transparent with you. And so, as you mentioned, there's certainly an emotional and psychological aspect that we're dealing with here, because we have an entire infrastructure and essentially civilization that's been built here in the DMV, not just based on the security of having the federal government, but also the defense contracting and government contracting that has built in the area as well. Unfortunately, the advice that I've given folks is there are some levels of resistance when you go back to your civics class and think about judicial review of certain executive actions. But there are parts of this that are well within President Trump's authority that we granted him when he was elected. And so some of these things will be able to be stopped. Some will be able to be slowed down. But as he's stated, if his goal is to significantly reduce the size of the federal government, then he absolutely will be able to do that. Now, how fast he does that and how much he does that, that'll be due to what type of resistance happens. But he will indeed be able to do that. So my advice to people is exactly kind of what this conversation is about tonight. It's time to make an assessment. Where are you in your career? How much longer, or do you have a chance to write it out? Are you a person earlier in your career? Is it time to get out? Because the other aspect of this is the intention is to increasingly politicize what used to be just regular government jobs. And so essentially what they're trying to do is put individuals that share their common political views into what would have just been, a run-of-the-mill type government job in the past that so many people that we know in this area have relied on for generations now.
So if you are a federal government worker who has taken the buyout, let us assume for this conversation that these buyouts will go forward. You take the buyout, but you still need to work and find a job. What is on your to-do list?
So the first thing is to really, really understand the terms that are associated with the buyouts. And so when you sign those things, you're agreeing to it. So, it's not like, accepting the next version of the operating system in your phone where you just click accept. You really need to read through, because there are going to be important information in there, not just related to the financial aspect of things, but what's going on with any retirement vesting, anything like that. So you really want to know, and I do understand these things are somewhat written in legalese, but even if you have to go to someone who is more versed at that, you need to understand what you're signing there. So that's the first thing. And once you've decided, hey, I'm out of here, but I still need to work, then there's some very specifics you need to do. And the first things are around planning and really goal setting. So at the end of the day, you got to think about, okay, what type of job do I want? Now, certain jobs in the government are going to be more or less transferable as they exist to the private sector. So if you do human resources or finance or IT or one of those types of jobs, those will typically transfer over to the private sector because they have your HR, your IT, your finance, but there are differences. So in the government, they're nonprofits, so to say. You're not doing work for a profit. When you get to the private sector, almost everything you do has to have a bottom line impact on profits. So there are some mindset changes that you have to think about, unless you decide, hey, I'm going to go work for a nonprofit organization, which can be more of a seamless type of situation. But the first thing you have to do is look at your background and then understand how it relates to jobs in the private sector.
Do the rules apply the same for someone who has taken a buyout versus someone who has been part of this mass firing?
Essentially, no. When it comes to, the only real difference is the amount of time that you have. So from what I have learned, the individual with the buyouts, they're at least to some degree going to have some sort of financial windfall. But some of these people that have received very short notices, and again, a lot of people are still, if not paycheck to paycheck, just a couple of paychecks to a couple of paychecks. And so the thing about the buyout is it does give you a little bit of a golden parachute there for a softer landing than what some of these other individuals. But at the end of the day, if you have to still go back to work, you still got to go back. Like I said, you got to stop and think about, okay, how does my background relate to the private sector? And some of these things are universal and standard in anyone that's seeking to make any sort of career change. But again, there's things that are a little different when you're going from the public sector government to the private sector. So once you've decided, okay, this is the type of job I'm looking for, then at that point, you got to kind of do your own self-assessment. Do I have the skills that are necessary for this job? And if you don't, you do that gap analysis and you got to think through, okay, what is it I'm going to do to obtain those skills so that I can be ready for that job? And you had mentioned this earlier. That's where you get into the transferable skills. So you have to be very realistic. And that's what the plan and the assessment and the analysis does for you. It gives you a real picture of the type of jobs that you can look for, because there's something very different in the private sector that doesn't exist in the government, which is there are no preferences, for example, for military or things like that. So you're going against everybody. And so if you don't have the requisite qualifications for the position, you're not likely going to make it, even through the application process to even get to an interview.
Which brings me to another question. This may be, while difficult for those who are leaving or may lose their jobs, from the perspective of those who would do the hiring and as well as HR professionals, is this almost like casting a net into a sea full of fish if you're looking for people, where you just have so many, great choices and maybe even enthusiastic people who want to work.
Absolutely, and that's a great catch. So, human resources professionals right now, particularly recruiters and talent acquisition folks, um, I don't want to present it as though people are happy that these things are happening,
Right,
but
right.
it does present opportunities, particularly in some of the areas, for example, healthcare. In healthcare right now, there's essentially a nationwide shortage for nurses and physical therapists and those types of folks. And so there's a large percentage of nurses that actually work in the federal. They might be at NIH, they might be at Bethesda Navy. So they're all over the place. So there is this opportunity that talent acquisition folks are thinking, especially when it comes to things like healthcare workers, when it comes to IT and technology folks. We're expecting to see a large influx into the job pool to basically be able to bolster your organization.
And I would imagine also that those in positions of hiring will see this huge influx of people who basically everybody's has left or lost their job at the same time. And so during the interview process, that question. So what can you share with me about, why you lost your last position? The
Yes,
answer is the same.
the answer is the same, but what I will say is probably over the last 10 years or so, the why you left your old job question hasn't been as relevant because there's been so much, so the generation that I came of age in, if you didn't stay somewhere for 5 years minimum, it kind of looked bad on your resume or your job hopper or that sort of thing. But nowadays, there are so many organizations that frankly shut down and fail. There are organizations that merge with other organizations. And so now that question of why you lost your job, it's not as relevant as it was before. What they really want to know is, do you have the skills? Do you have the ability to do the job in the future that I'm asking you to do? But to answer the question directly, people have probably had no greater answer to that question in history because everybody kind of knows it's no different than around 2020 when people would be looking at job because we got shut down because of the pandemic, and so everybody understood that. So it's going to be a similar thing as this plays out.
How will networking work in your view for the people who during this particular time have left or lost their job?
So networking is huge. And earlier I mentioned how the government application practice has preferences baked into it. And I said that the private sector doesn't. Well, that's not totally true. It's just not baked officially into the process. So networking is one of the things that I tell job seekers they can't do enough of. Because in reality, when you see a job that's posted online, and I can't give you percentages because no one knows, but sometimes when you see a job posted online, it's not actually a real job. They've already identified somebody for that job and they're posting it online to get you go. But networking gives you kind of that access to be the early bird to the worm, right? And so if you know individuals utilizing things like LinkedIn, if you know individuals that work at an organization that you're trying to get into, they typically know that a position is going to come open before it happened because they're friends with the guy who just put their resignation in. So if you have that network, it's, hey, I know this guy, Harold, he's pretty good. He's looking for a job. And so anything that you can do to get your foot in the door, and most importantly, become a bit of a known commodity, even if it's through a referral. HR people love referrals because to some degree, it's kind of a crapshoot whenever you're trying to hire people. You'll interview them, you'll look at resumes, but if you look at the actual correlations between those things and the success of a person, it's actually pretty minimal. But what is a higher correlation to success are people that come referred. And so we love getting people that are referred. So I would tell everybody to really, really brush up on their networking, and don't be shy about it. Let your social media network know that you are looking for a position, that you might possibly be, be getting separated, whatever it might be, but let them know, and you'll be surprised what opportunities are presented to you.
Something just occurred to me. I can foresee in a month or so an organization that forms like the National Association of Doge Fired Workers.
Yeah.
I mean, I say that tongue in cheek, but for some reason, I think at some point that is going to be a real thing.
Absolutely. I mean, as we mentioned before, Democrats just elected a new party chair, and
Right.
he has come out swinging, saying that they're ready to start attacking some of these things that we've been seeing. The constitutionality of Doge and the person that's running it are, it's up in the air right now. And so there are some judges out there that have stood up and are going. So I think you're going to start seeing more challenges, and you're going to see a little, some halting of some of the things that you've seen. But, at the end of the day, power perceived is power achieved. So if they send you a form and you say, oh, I got to take it, and you take it and you're gone, then you're gone. And as you mentioned earlier, a lot of people are. And so this is happening, like we said, but the question is how much it's going to happen. And so you're right. There are tens of thousands, there are likely hundreds of thousands of individuals that are going to be affected by it. And the question is going to be, do we have an infrastructure in the private sector outside of the public sector that can absorb those folks? And that answer is questionable.
Which brings me to the next point. We've been talking about workers, but what about contractors? Because as we've seen, for example, with USAID, not only did they get rid of the workers, but they also got rid of the contractors. Well, whether you are a small business contractor with 5 to 10 people doing custodial services in a building, or you're a big contractor with a multi-million-dollar contract and a track record, you may have just been thrown out on your tail. So what does this portend for contractors who are now without contracts for a particular agency?
Excellent observation, Harold. And that's one of the things that I fear, particularly for our area. So Maryland and Virginia are two of the top 5 states, along with obviously California, Texas, and Florida, that employ the most federal workers. And obviously that also includes contractors. So as most people know, contractors don't necessarily get the benefit of a lot of the employment laws that actual employees get. So again, all the union stuff that you were talking about earlier, that's for actual employees. And so contractors, they get a raw deal, and typically you don't need a reason to end a contract. Most contracts typically have some sort of language of notice. And as long as you fulfill that notice date, most of them are like 30 days, then
Right.
you can sever the contract. And so the impact of the contracting space on this area that has supported the federal government is going to be substantial. And frankly, if you think about, really the largest increases and the federal bureaucracy, i.e. government jobs, really occurred, back in, the 30s with FDR, essentially trying to get America back to work out of the Depression, creating roads, infrastructure, that sort of thing. And then LBJ's Great Society, which focused on a lot of civil rights legislation and different things like that, again, creating jobs like the EEOC and certain aspects in the Department of Labor and whatnot. And so the tough thing to think through here is that a lot of these jobs were created originally to give people work. And now with them going away, it's pretty clear that the private sector has not grown along with the public sector to be able to absorb these people. So this is a crisis. And the best advice I can give people is be that early bird. It likely will be a game of musical chairs, and you want to make sure you can get yourself a chair before the music stops.
Do you have any resources that you can suggest for people who are not used to looking for a new job or networking, if they've had that, quote, good government job for so long and now may not be ready to retire, but are looking at the prospect of losing their government job? What do you suggest?
Absolutely. So I'll start off with kind of some self-directed materials. So one thing that I highly recommend is called the Occupational Outlook Handbook. You can go and Google search it. It's actually a government document. But essentially, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what it allows you to do is not only look by industry, but you can also look by specific jobs. And what it lets you know is, hey, these are the qualifications and skills you need. This is what a typical day looks like. But most importantly, it lets you know which industries and individual jobs are primed for growth over the next decade.
Okay.
And that's very important, so people can know, okay. And so just as we mentioned, obviously things like healthcare, anything technology related, but other things people might not think about are renewable energy. So there are going to be a lot more renewable energy jobs. And then specific to the technology piece is about data. So data scientists, statisticians, those sort of things, as you start thinking about these tremendous amounts of data that we're starting to regularly utilize. So the first thing I would say from a self-directed standpoint is if you want to understand kind of where you're trying to go. And that resource, the Occupational Outlook Handbook, is a great resource for that.
Let me have one more before I wrap up.
Sure. And next, the other piece is, you can always go to a career coach. So you can put my information, when you post this, people can come to someone like myself. There are people like me all over LinkedIn that can provide people. Think of it more like a personal trainer for looking for a job. Yeah, you can go in your basement and lift weights, but if you want a professional to help out, you should go to a career coach.
Do you have a website or any contact information you can share with us real quick?
I do. You can reach me at on my email at the word unite, UNITE, the number 4 at yahoo.com. And if you mention Harold's name, you'll get a special gift.
I like that. I really appreciate that. Wow. Sean Talley, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Lots of work ahead.
All righty.
That is the Daily Drum for this Friday, February 7th. Don't forget, you can hear this in every edition of the Daily Drum Insight segment via podcast on WHUR.com. The original Quiet Storm with Raheem Devon is next on WHUR. For News Director Renee Nash, I'm Harold Fisher. Good night and have a wonderful weekend.